Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Trump's war on Antifa enters a new phase.
First terrorism charges against the so-called Antifa movement filed in the case of the attack at an immigration facility in Alvarado. Two suspects accused are charged with providing material support to terrorists.
Is the Trump administration using the fear of political violence to limit free speech? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take. Before we continue with today's show, please be sure to leave us a comment and let us know what stories you'd like us to do next. And if you're on the podcast app, let us know where you're listening from and leave us a 5-star review. It'll help more people find the show.
My name is Jason Blazakis. I'm a professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, where I also run a research center, the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism.
Hi, Jason, and welcome to The Take. So I want to start with a case that's been making headlines. Two men, Cameron Arnold and Zachary Evitz, are set to appear in court in Texas on Wednesday for allegedly attacking an ICE or Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention facility on July 4th. Prosecutors say that they were part of an Antifa cell and have charged them under federal terrorism laws. So this is important because this is the first time that terrorism charges have been used in connection with the Antifa label. I should say their lawyers say their clients deny the charges. So what details can you give us about what happened and what exactly are these men accused of doing?
So these individuals are accused of carrying out an ambush in Prairieland, Texas, and have been charged for the alleged attack. Amongst those charges was a terrorism charge, what we call a material support charge, and that was pursuant to the section of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is support for an act of terrorism. But what's really interesting about those charges is that the government goes to great lengths to try to label these individuals as being part of, quote, an Antifa cell. And this is the first time I've seen the government extrapolate in an indictment like this against individuals it perceives to be Antifa. And if you look at some of the public comments from the Attorney General Pam Bondi and the Director of the FBI, Kash Patel, they've both also been very clear that this is a precedential prosecution and indictment of these individuals for the work that they're doing on behalf of this so-called Antifa group that they've been labeled and connected to in the U.S. government indictment.
And I understand that these were two men that were part of a larger group as well, right?
That's right. There was the government alleges about 10 individuals were involved in this incident. And the incident is being characterized by the government as one led by a, quote, Antifa cell.
Right. I mean, and it does on its face appear to be a very violent attack, an ambush on this detention facility. And I think we should mention, because we have an international audience, we don't know why these men allegedly attacked the facility, but a few more details about the place where it happened. The Prairieland Detention Center is in Alvarado, Texas. It's a place where ICE officers are holding migrants before deportation. We know that most of the immigrants that are being held there have no criminal records. And in fact, being undocumented in the U.S. is not even a crime. It's a civil infraction. According to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, people who've been detained in Prairieland have described it as an overcrowded and unsanitary space. Now, President Trump recently talked about the attack, saying that the attack was carried out by, quote, Antifa-aligned militants.
In July, approximately a dozen Antifa-aligned militants stormed the ICE facility in Texas and then lured officers out of the building before firing dozens of rounds at police. They were crazy, frankly, shooting one Texas officer in the neck.
How are federal prosecutors framing this as an Antifa attack? I mean, what's the hard evidence that they're pointing to?
If you look at the 12-page indictment as I have, there's very little evidence specifically and concretely that links the individuals to Antifa. And I think it's important perhaps to even take a step back to talk about, like, what is Antifa? Antifa is not a cohesive organization. And in fact, many people, including me, see it more as an ideology than a coherent organization, which makes these charges of linking up these individuals to a so-called group really fascinating.
People on the left and the far left say that Antifa doesn't exist. It's a state of mind, blah, 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 blah. I mean, if they're not real, then how come two people were indicted and that they were involved in attacking the ICE facility? They have to be real. It's not a state of mind.
Yeah, I encourage everyone to read the first sentence of the indictment. It says the North Texas Antifa cell.
I mean, Antifa stands for anti-fascism, right?
Yeah, precisely. And fascism is something I think a lot of Americans generally are against. Does that mean Americans are likely to carry out and wage acts of violence because they are against fascism? Very unlikely, right? So there are a few individuals in this case, though, that saw the ICE facility clearly as a target. But we know very little about the underlying motivations. If you look at that indictment, there's a reference to one of the attackers communicating in a chat forum saying that he's against the police. Against blue is specifically the term utilized. And a lot of individuals that aren't part of violent extremist organizations in the United States have a heavy sense of angst when it comes to government authority and police authority. So it's a very strange way of labeling these individuals and putting them in sort of this world in orbit of Antifa, when really the only thing presented in way of motivation is that we have an individual who is against the police.
So, like, all of this is coming after President Donald Trump issued an executive order, I think last month, declaring Antifa a, quote, domestic terrorist organization. So you're just starting to get into, like, what does that even mean? And what are the practical implications of that?
In practice, that was more of a normative or signaling statement that the president sees Antifa as a terrorist group. There aren't any charges that can be applied to individuals acting on behalf of Antifa because of that executive order. Really, there are only two national competent authorities in the United States that can designate terrorists: the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Department of Treasury, neither of which have acted against Antifa today as a terrorist group.
So you're saying that the president doesn't actually have the authority to designate the Antifa as a domestic terrorist group, that, you know, so there's no sort of legal mechanism for the president to do this. You know, Antifa isn't an organization, as you mentioned, with clear membership or a hierarchy or anything that makes it an organization. Like, it doesn't have like a leader, like, say, a group like Patriot Front. So what is the danger of treating a broad concept like Antifa or a loose protest movement like a, quote, domestic terrorist organization?
So Antifa, again, to many experts, is not seen as a larger organization like Al-Qaeda, where you could appoint it to Osama bin Laden as a figurehead and leader, or ISIS, pointing to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, or in the United States, the Proud Boys and Enrique Tarrio, who stormed the Capitol on January 6th of 2021. And by labeling something an organization when it doesn't exist, it really does allow for the Department of Justice and the FBI to take a broader approach to trying to charge individuals for perceived crimes against the state. Who is part of Antifa? It could be anybody, quite possibly, who's against fascism. And that's what makes this especially dangerous and a threat to civil liberties in the United States.
And you were starting to mention that when the president designates a group without really the legal authority to do this, a domestic terrorist organization like he did with Antifa in September, that it's very dangerous. Maybe you could go back into explaining why is it so dangerous?
It's dangerous because it can weaponize various aspects of the government bureaucracy. And in the case of the executive order, it's been very clear in the follow-on executive order that came out a few weeks ago on so-called domestic terrorism, the National Security Policy Memorandum number 7 that President Trump issued. It was the operationalizing of his previous executive order, where essentially he called on joint terrorism task forces throughout the country, and there are about 200 of them in the United States, to go after this perceived threat posed by left-wing ideologists and extremists that the president has declared a terrorist entity. So it's weaponizing not just federal resources like the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Department of Justice, but it's also co-opting state and local law enforcement, because joint terrorism task forces are comprised of state, local, and federal. And in that sense, a lot of governors may have a great amount of angst of participating in President Trump's very one-sided view of what the threat in the United States constitutes as.
All of this kind of reminds me of a case out of Arizona a few years back where a prosecutor there accused a group of Black Lives Matter protesters of being part of a gang called ACAB. And of course, ACAB is a popular slogan that you're going to hear at demonstrations for police reform that stands for, quote, all cops are bastards. Now, there was no ACAB gang. This was something that the prosecutor had made up. But by calling them a gang, all of a sudden they would face much harsher punishments. The prosecutor who brought up the case ended up having her law license suspended for the phony charges. But would you say that what's happening in Texas is basically the same idea, like trying to link people to a criminal network, but taken to the national level under the banner of counterterrorism?
The words terrorism have significant impact if they're deployed in any way, whether legitimately or, in this case, potentially under false pretenses, because it really energizes the entire government to carry out activities, investigations, in some cases, kinetic responses against those who are part of the so-called terrorist network. So in that sense, it can result in the inappropriate use of force, the inappropriate labeling of individuals as bad actors that could have really profound consequences on the preservation of a democracy. And will this lead to the rise of things like vigilantism in the name of fulfilling the president's order in response to perceived threats that exist? And to me, that's another element of this, is by labeling people who are anti-fascist to be terrorists, it's a call, a kind of like a dog whistle for people to go after perceived enemies. And I think that's, again, very dangerous.
More with Jason after the break.
Esmond Bradley Martin, one of the world's leading investigators of the illegal poaching trade, was murdered in his own home in Nairobi, Kenya in 2018. To this day, nobody knows who killed Esmond or why. Was it because of his work, or was it a different reason altogether? Hear from Esmond's friends and colleagues in True Crime Reports.
You were at the State Department for a decade, right? Overseeing this very process of designating terrorist groups and individuals, which again makes you the perfect person to explain to us, what that process is and answer that question. How does the U.S. actually determine what qualifies as a terrorist organization? Walk us through that process.
So in the time in which I led the Office to Sanction Terrorists between 2008 and 2018, we would only nominate to the Secretary of State organizations that fit 3 legal criteria. The first is the foreignness test. In the United States, we don't have a mechanism to designate domestic terrorist groups because of great concern about the erosion of civil liberties like the First Amendment if we were to do so. So is the group based overseas? Does it have also, as part of the first prong of the legal criteria, a coherent organization? Do we know who the leaders are? Do we know where their so-called terrorist camps are located, for instance? And then the second criteria is that group carrying out terrorist activity? Are they carrying out improvised explosive device attacks or assassinations targeting innocent civilians in an effort to create some kind of political, religious, or social change? And then the third criteria is that terrorist activity a threat to U.S. national security interests, which is pretty broadly defined to include economic, foreign policy, defense interests. But the most important part when it comes to thinking about Antifa is it a foreign coherent organization? And I don't think it even meets the first prong. If we were at the State Department in a different time period, I don't think we would be able to put forward a credible argument to the Secretary of State for designation today.
So why then do you think that the Trump administration has decided to designate it as a domestic terrorist organization?
That's the great question. I think there's a few things going on here. Now, there is legitimately a rise of left-wing extremism in the United States. There was a study recently done by a think tank that evaluated between January of this year and July of this year the number of attacks in the United States. In that 6-month period of time, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, saw that there were 5 attacks attributable to those individuals who might have a left-wing ideology, and 1 attack associated with those who might adhere to a far-right ideology. And we're talking very small numbers, and I'm really skeptical that the president is probably looking at those numbers to make a decision to go after Antifa. So I think the more likely outcome is that this is a politically driven decision by President Trump to make his base feel more secure and safe.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly where I was going next. I remember a few years ago, back in 2021 during the Joe Biden administration, the Attorney General at the time, Merrick Garland, and Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, they told the Senate then that the biggest domestic terror threat was coming from those espousing white supremacist ideology, extremist right-wing groups. So I was going to say, are we still seeing a lot of violence coming from those groups?
So the numbers are indicative that threat has decreased at least this year. And I think there are a couple of reasons that might explain why that's the case. First, and I say foremost, is the fact that in January 6, 2021, in the aftermath, there was more than 800 people prosecuted for storming the Capitol building, for carrying out violence. That has a significant deterrent effect. So those that are on the so-called radical right side of the political spectrum, whether it's the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, neo-Nazi groups, they understood that the stakes were high and they could lose their livelihood and end up behind bars. I think those prosecutions had a significant deterrent effect.
Even though Trump ended up pardoning
even
them.
though, in this time period, and this gets to my second point, they were pardoned and their sentences were commuted. And the second part of it is why violence may have dropped recently is the perception that they have a supporter in the White House, and that the White House is going to take action against their political enemies. And I think if you look at what's happening right now with the issuance of this executive order as one example, they might have a reason to believe that.
In this time of so much political polarization, what's the difference between Garland and Mayorkas saying that right-wing groups were the biggest domestic terror threat during the Biden administration, and Trump now saying that the same thing about the so-called radical left or Antifa? Is it fair to say that both sides are emphasizing violence coming from their perceived political enemies, or is there something more going on here?
I think there's something more going on, at least in the way in which the previous administration treated the challenge of domestic extremism. And until this year, the lead up to this year, the most significant threat in way of domestic extremism and terrorism and political violence in the United States, unquestionably, is a threat posed by individuals who subscribe to a right-wing ideology, whether white supremacists, neo-Nazis, anti-authoritarian groups. And if you look at the numbers produced even by this recent study by CSIS, it's very clear that until this year, it had been right-wing extremism as the most pernicious threat. If you look at the University of Maryland's data at the Study for Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism in its global terrorism database, a far-right threat was much more significant. So speaking statistically, the Biden administration was right to focus its energy on those types of threats.
And I mean, it makes me also think about the recent killing of Charlie Kirk. You know, if you look at that incident, it can be difficult to determine what the exact motivation was behind the violence and other incidents like that. So are we missing something when we attempt to categorize political violence as left or right?
In the context of the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, the shooter, from what we know, so far as what the government's presented to us, is somebody who was pro-LGBTQ, and there are a lot of Republicans who are pro-lesbian, gay as well. That doesn't mean that the individual who carried out the Kirk attack is somehow automatically a left-wing ideology-driven extremist. And I think the government needs to be very careful about how they characterize individuals' motivations. And in the case of the Kirk attack, we saw J.D. Vance and others just within minutes say that this was a far left-wing attack. And what that does is it catalyzes audiences to see the world through a very black and white prism, as opposed to all the gray and ambiguity that exists. And that really creates us versus them narratives that only further polarize the American population.
Now, and again, you worked at the State Department for a decade, and so you have an insider view on how these terrorism labels are used and sometimes abused, right? So one thing that's interesting to note, again, for our audiences is just how far back this label applies. The first mention of terrorism in the U.S. law is as far back as 1969, you know, and these laws have been applied to Arabs and Muslims in the U.S. for a long, long time. So when you see them now being used as they are today, do you reflect any differently about not only where all of this is heading, but how it all got started in the first place?
So generally, when we think about labeling organizations as terrorist groups, it's often triggered by a significant event. And the issuance of terrorist designations under U.S. law really postdates a lot of the things that were being discussed in the 60s and 70s in response to activities happening throughout the Middle East. A lot of people would argue that those were national liberation movements trying to secure statehood from colonial oppressors. The United States and the West tried to label that as terrorism. And this is actually why the United Nations never came to an agreement on what terrorism is. Because, of course, the old adage, one individual might see a terrorist as a freedom fighter, the other as a terrorist. But with the adoption of various executive orders, the so-called foreign terrorist organization listing process from the late 1990s, I think the United States started taking a more of a very targeted approach to thinking about bad actors. And my worry is that we're moving away from that decision-making process and making decisions based on politics. And you can even take a look at some of the recent decisions of the Trump administration when they labeled various Mexican drug cartels, Venezuelan gangs, Haitian gangs as terrorist groups. That's really changing the meaning of what we think about terrorism when we're lumping in financially motivated individuals as terrorists as well, as part of a government effort then to weaponize other parts of the government to go after those enemies.
So, Jason, how concerned are you about the way that you see this administration using some of these labels?
I'm greatly concerned that these decisions will have a profound effect on American civil liberties in the name of security, but in the reality, what's really being pursued seems like politics.